Let's begin with what the Justice Department intends to do under the leadership of Joe Biden in response to police brutality and what we've experienced in Minneapolis.
I am announcing that the Justice Department has opened a civil investigation to determine whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing.
And that was Attorney General Merrick Garland, who has announced that not only will he go back to beefing up consent decrees to ensure that police departments who have been found violating the constitutional rights of citizens will have to be held accountable, will have to deal with the consequences of that. But he's announcing there that they're going to be launching an investigation, a civil investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. This comes immediately after Derek Chauvin, a former Minneapolis cop, was found guilty on 3 separate charges in relation to his murder of George Floyd. And so this is a really good update to the story, because while it was nice to see Derek Chauvin, have to face some accountability for what he did, that by no means is the end all be all in fighting for justice and accomplishing justice when it comes to policing in this country. I mean, immediately after Derek Chauvin was found guilty and convicted, we learned that a Columbus, Ohio police officer shot and killed a teenager, a story that we'll get to a little later in the show today. But John, before we get to more of the details of what this DOJ investigation entails, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So someone was killed yesterday. If they haven't already been killed today, they will be, and they probably have been.
Yeah.
As you point out, it's not the be all end all. The verdict, it's not anything like that. In fact, as we will talk about later in the hour, it seems like in terms of Congress, it might have set back. Actually having some sort of substantive change that goes beyond the fate of one man. So we can compare the approach of different administrations. Obama had done a few things like this at one point. Trump never would have, ever. He dispatched goon squads to black bag people. Like, they were never gonna have anything like this. And so with Biden, we get Merrick Garland looking into it. But I guess I'm just not ready to be excited about that. Like, they'll find, hopefully, what we know to be true, which is no cop almost ever faces charges, let alone actually gets convicted of crimes. Okay, so that's waiting for them to find. I guess they have to act like they don't already know. But then what will come of it? Some sort of like grand sweeping executive orders? Maybe. Biden could in theory do that. Maybe if he wants to be seen as some sort of bold FDR 2.0, he will. But if not that, then it's gonna be something that has to go through Congress. And we are getting those signals already that they don't have an appetite for significant change in this area.
That's a great point, because while Congress really remains broken and divided, which leads to them basically accomplishing very little to nothing, you can then look to the Biden administration to take any type of executive action to investigate various police departments. In this case, we're talking about Minneapolis. But at the end of the day, all you need is a Republican administration to come in and essentially undo what the previous administration had done. And that was certainly the case with the consent decrees. So the consent decrees were implemented in various police departments across the country, including in Baltimore, Chicago, Ferguson. Jeff Sessions, immediately before he got fired by Donald Trump, decided to essentially dismantle those consent decrees and essentially make them toothless. What Merrick Garland did on Friday of last week was essentially re-implement those consent decrees. And then today he announced the investigation into this particular police department. And he explains specific reasons why and what the objective is. Take a look.
Congress gave the department the authority to conduct civil pattern or practice investigations, which look beyond individual incidents to assess systemic failures. Those investigations allow the department to determine whether a police department has a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. The investigation I am announcing today will assess whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of using excessive force, including during protests. The investigation will also assess whether the MPD engages in discriminatory conduct and whether its treatment of those with behavioral health disabilities is unlawful. It will include a comprehensive review of the Minneapolis Police Department's policies, training, supervision, and use of force investigations. It will assess the effectiveness of the MPD's current systems of accountability and whether other mechanisms are needed to ensure constitutional and lawful policing.
So he was clear about what they're looking for, what the objective is. And John, you had a great question about what does it mean once they find that there was wrongdoing within this police department. Well, he did lay that out a little bit. So the New York Times reported that if the investigators find that the police department has engaged in unlawful policing, Garland said that the Justice Department would issue a public report. So that's step one. It also has the option, doesn't mean that they're definitely gonna do it, but it also has the option to bring a civil suit against the department and enter into a settlement agreement or consent decree, what I was talking about earlier, to ensure that prompt and effective action is taken to bring the department's practices into compliance with the law. So this is one of a few options that we have in the federal government in basically intervening and ensuring that local police departments aren't violating the constitutional rights of its citizens. But again, I think you're absolutely right. You need Congress to act, and based on what we're seeing in Congress in various police reform hearings, we'll talk about some of that later in the show, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm overall pessimistic. I think that the investigation could be good. If they're gonna go into all of those different areas, the training and stuff like that, it's not that we are gonna be on the edge of our seat wondering if they'll find anything, but they can, in theory, sketch out in a high profile way. This is gonna be, the results will eventually be announced by the federal government. So this is something that's gonna demand some attention. And then, they can talk about exactly what the training is like, what the hiring practices are like. In theory, I mean, I don't know about this particular police department, but they could go into things like white supremacist infiltration of police departments. I think, in theory, if this were broader, encompassing multiple different areas, like they're looking at this one because this is the case that we just experienced, but what about all the high profile cop killings of the past few years that we didn't get to investigate because we weren't president yet? Like, you could go into Chicago, you could go into LA, you could go into these areas. What is it, like after 2 years, it's not a crime anymore? Like, it's not a sin what was done? I would prefer to see something a bit broader.
Yeah.
That in theory could be what Congress does, but we'll see if they actually want to do that.
Right, and to be clear, they don't. I mean, there are certainly some Democratic lawmakers who are pushing for this. At the same time, when you're dealing with a Republican Party that has based its entire political identity on culture war issues and essentially branding themselves as pro-cop, with the exception of the Capitol riots. In that case, maybe not so pro-cop. They're not gonna move away from that branding that they've built for themselves. I mean, that is their entire political party. What else do Republican voters get from Republican lawmakers? What other promises do they get? What else do Republican lawmakers talk about? Nothing. I mean, if Republican lawmakers actually incessantly talked about how they protect business interests as much as they talk about how racist they are, then I don't know, maybe they wouldn't get many voters. They're already incredibly unpopular, which is why they have to rig elections to their advantage. But putting that aside, the one other thing I wanted to mention is, look, just how disastrous the Trump administration was on all fronts. I mean, we know that, but when you look at what Jeff Sessions specifically did to consent decrees and the reasoning he gave to essentially make them toothless, it gives you a sense of how little they respect human lives, how little they care to protect people who are unarmed and have been brutalized by cops. Sessions, according to the New York Times at the time, had imposed 3 stringent requirements for the agreements. Top political appointees must sign off on these consent decrees, okay? Rather than career lawyers who have done so in the past. Department lawmakers, or lawyers I should say, department lawyers must lay out evidence of additional violations beyond unconstitutional behavior. I would argue unconstitutional behavior is good enough, good enough. But I'll give you more. And the deals must have a sunset date rather than being in place until police or other law enforcement agencies have shown improvement. That's what Jeff Sessions did. And so there's already a little bit of progress with consent decrees being re-implemented and actually having some enforcement behind them. That's a little bit of good news. But again, like systemically, you have to take a good look, like take a step back, take a look at what's happening, even in a place like Minneapolis right now, right? Sure, Derek Chauvin was convicted of all 3 charges, but at the same time, it's like a war zone there, meaning that it's like overly militarized in order to prevent people from practicing their First Amendment.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's part of this.
Yeah, and it's good that they, by name called out that they're going to be focusing on violence against protesters.
Yeah.
Maybe they can find something. I don't know. We covered a few instances last year.
With the exception of like a handful of states, most states in this country have either already passed laws that would brutalize protesters, as the case in Florida shows, or they have the legislation pending, you know?
I think it's 33 different states this year have that sort of legislation that's either passed or they're talking about it.
Yeah, so it's hard to say that justice was served. Maybe you can say that when it comes to one particular case involving George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. But when you look at the systemic issues at play here, obviously we haven't even begun to chip away at it.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.